了，都让一下，让一下。
我怎么不听你们不着急啊？管人们什么家属呢
？Our thoughts and prayers are with the bereaved families affected.
These movements are consistent with deliberate action by someone on the plane.
The operation has entered a new phase. The search was already a highly complex, multinational effort. It has now become even more difficult.
The arrivals board at Beijing Airport was the first indication that something was wrong. Flight MH370 wasn't delayed, it was missing. The news started to filter out to the world and the relatives waiting at the airport. What had happened overnight to the 239 people on board, their loved ones, is a mystery.
My father just died because of this news. I had to deal with that before I came here.
I don't think the families will be satisfied until they find out what happened to the aircraft. And I think you have a range of emotions in there from people who are very vocal and very angry about the situation and very frustrated at the lack of information in terms of where is the aircraft.
The likelihood of this having been something catastrophic having happened to the aeroplane, just forget it. It wasn't that. Catastrophic things do not happen to modern airplanes. They just don't.
But new information suggests the plane could have been hijacked. We're now told that the plane kept flying for hours after it disappeared off radar screens. But why? And in what direction? This programme will examine the developments in this fast-moving investigation. This is MH370, a modern Boeing 777-200 aircraft. Its route was a scheduled red-eye flight leaving Kuala Lumpur daily at 35 minutes past midnight, flying through the night to land in Beijing at 6:30 in the morning. On Saturday the 8th of March, it never arrived. A multinational search operation is launched. Rescue teams from Malaysia, Singapore and Vietnam start looking for wreckage in the South China Sea. The Philippines sends a ship to join the hunt.
Usual telltale from any airplane that crashes into the sea, the one thing that immediately floats are seat cushions. You know, they're not tied down. They will, as the hull breaks up, seat cushions will be floating everywhere. That's been a trademark of aircraft crashing into the sea.
The operation is initially centred around the last known location of the aircraft. The route it should have taken would have led it up the eastern coast of Vietnam, then north over China towards Beijing. Around an hour into the flight, contact was lost near the To Chu Islands. At 1:30 a.m, air traffic control in Kuala Lumpur spoke to the flight deck. "We've handed you over to Ho Chi Minh Air Traffic Control," was the message. "OK, received. Good night," was the reply. It was the last anyone heard of them. Early into the search, an oil slick is spotted. It quickly becomes the focus of attentions, but within hours is dismissed as having no connection to the flight. Likewise, some debris floating on the sea that looked like it could be a part of a plane door. It turned out not to be. Commercial flights continue above the Malay Peninsula. But the Chinese, fearing terrorism might be the cause, tighten security at their airports as it becomes apparent that there is something not quite right about the passenger manifest. Two names shouldn't be on there. One is an Austrian called Christian Kozel, the other an Italian called Luigi Moraldi. It turns out that neither man boarded the plane. They are, indeed, alive and well. Investigators discover that both had had their passports stolen in Thailand. So who then was travelling using their names? The sinister prospect of terrorism becomes the latest line of inquiry.
If it is terrorism, and we don't know at all that it is yet, but if it is, it's going to be a real wake-up call to a region that thought that was other people's problem, not theirs.
It takes almost 2 days of checking intelligence databases and going through CCTV systematically to establish who the men are. But finally, there is a breakthrough. The 2 men travelling on stolen passports are identified as Iranians, but with no known connections to terrorism. It is believed they were trying to claim asylum in Europe. Interpol named them as Puri Noor Mohammadi and 29-year-old Delavar Saeed Mohammed Reza. They confirm that they boarded the plane using the stolen passports.
We know that once these 2 individuals arrived in Kuala Lumpur on the 28th of February, they boarded Flight 370 using different identities.
The operation by now is clutching at straws. For some relatives waiting at a Beijing hotel for news, the desperation is overwhelming. Family lives have been put on hold until the truth is known.
I've got a 3-year-old who's asking, when's Daddy going to Skype? You know, and he's got a map on his wall where Daddy plotted where his Dad's going to be, and so, you know, he looks around and he says, when's Dad going to Skype? Will Daddy be there? When will he Skype? So, luckily he's with friends at the moment, but I will cross that bridge when I have to cross that bridge if I have to.
So difficult is it to accept that a plane can simply disappear with no trace. Some choose not to.
If Philip is dead, I refuse to believe it. Of anybody that could survive something like this, it's him. I mean, he's such a fighter, and he has so much to live for.
The search in the vast Gulf of Thailand and South China Sea is now extended to an area covering hundreds of square miles. Then a theory emerges that the plane might have turned around completely. Rescue teams begin looking at the western peninsula of Malaysia, the Straits of Malacca, one of the world's busiest shipping channels. The reason for the change is that the Malaysian military say that they tracked a plane there on radar at 2:15 in the early hours of Saturday morning, around 45 minutes after the plane vanished from air traffic control screens.
If the airplane did turn off its original course, then it's flying over some very sparsely populated areas, including places like the Burmese rainforest. And an airplane even as big as the 777, if it was intact when it crashed into the rainforest, it could be unseen for months. You know, there would be nothing to see from above, and to actually locate it on the ground would be very difficult indeed.
In another twist of possible hope, newly released satellite images appear to show smoke rising from the ocean south of Vietnam. Again, search teams are dispatched, but like so many leads in this investigation, this one is quickly dashed. The Boeing 777-200 is one of the most modern passenger aircraft currently in the skies. 2 enormous Rolls-Royce engines enable it to fly huge distances. Even if one failed, it should be able to keep flying without any problem at all. The rescue teams by now have covered thousands of square miles of open sea, meticulously searching for any sign of Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 and the 239 people on board. But it transpires they were looking in the wrong place all of this time.
Philip is dead. I refuse to believe it.
These movements are consistent with deliberate action by someone on the plane.
On Saturday the 8th of March, Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 vanished without trace and without reason. Its whereabouts has confused experts and baffled the world. Relatives wait for answers, many refusing to give up hope of finding their loved ones alive. The search has now become a multinational operation involving dozens of aircraft and ships, but still nobody knows what happened to the 239 people on board this fateful flight. The longer the search goes on, theories that might have been initially dismissed as outlandish are now being treated as credible. Every day, the authorities brief the waiting families on the latest in the investigation. But with no sign of the plane, the grief is becoming unbearable. Emotions are running high. And then, finally, some news. A press conference is called. In Beijing, the families prepared to watch it, nervously, expectantly. A week to the day that flight MH370 went missing, with speculation running wild and desperation growing, the Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak reveals to the world major new developments.
We can say with a high degree of certainty that the aircraft communications addressing and reporting system, or ACUS, was disabled just before the aircraft reached the east coast of Peninsular Malaysia. Shortly afterwards, near the border between Malaysia and Vietnamese air traffic control, the aircraft's transponder was switched off. It then flew in a westerly direction back over Peninsular Malaysia before turning northwest. Up until the point at which it left military primary radar coverage, these movements are consistent with deliberate action by someone on the plane.
The search of the South China Sea is now over, but rescue teams face the prospect of a new area, which is much bigger, much harder.
According to the new data, the last confirmed communication between the plane and the satellite was at 8:11 a.m. Malaysian time on Saturday, 8th of March. The investigation team is making further calculations which will indicate how far the aircraft may have flown after the last point of contact. This will help us to refine the search.
The last verbal contact the plane had with air traffic control was near Vietnam's To Chu Islands on the original flight path, after it had been flying for an hour. It's now been confirmed that it then turned west and was picked up on military radar. It's believed to have flown within two flight corridors, one that stretches north over Thailand towards the border with Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, or through a southern one that goes from Indonesia to the Indian Ocean. This is thought because a satellite, which is 35,800 kilometres above sea level in the Indian Ocean, received a ping or a signal from the plane from those locations. The aircraft had enough fuel to carry on flying for another 2,700 miles, the equivalent of 5 hours. This now is the search area the authorities are looking at. John Lindsay is a former head of air safety at British Airways with vast experience flying the Boeing 777, the same model of aircraft that has disappeared without trace. And Professor David Stubbles lectures at City University in London. He is a specialist in radar and used to work with the Royal Signals radar establishment.
The last communication was with Malaysian air traffic control, and they were handed over, as the expression goes, to the Vietnamese air traffic control and never called in. We know then that there is ground tracking capability of the aircraft, but we also know that the aircraft has a lot of information and data that it also sends back to the ground via its various onboard communications devices.
Yeah, that's right. So therefore, what would happen is the aircraft will be pinged from the ground, and its transponder on board will actually be sending back its position and its height.
Let's just remind ourselves that the airplane intended flight path was over here towards Beijing. Yeah. So, and we know that it had a fuel capability to get it to Beijing and beyond, because there will be reserve fuel on there. So typically there will be enough fuel on board to take it for an hour's flying time past Beijing.
Right.
So we have to consider then an area that the aeroplane could be in, which would be an hour's flying time beyond Beijing. So we're sweeping round really all the way down to Sri Lanka, the Philippines, and sort of East Timor over here as being the potential area.
But there was some evidence came out earlier from the military radars again, which said that they got a track of an aircraft which was unknown turning across and in towards the Andaman Sea.
So what that suggests is that it might have at some stage turned in this direction here. If that was our aeroplane, then why was it there, and why were they not talking to anyone?
I doubt it was a failure because of all the duplicated and the triplicated systems on board. So therefore what we're left with is to say, well, there's an unknown reason why it's come across here, which means, of course, not only do we have a search area here, but we have a search area here, we have a search area here, and all the way around, well, certainly around this side, assuming that that track was right.
Yeah, radar only tracked it to a certain distance, but once beyond that, it could have turned in any direction within the Bay of Bengal is entirely unknown.
But the interesting thing is, the depth of the water here is about 60 to 70 metres. The depth of the water out here is several thousand metres.
It is, yes, indeed.
And so therefore, if the aircraft did come down in here, it would have come down in much deeper water.
Well, if we're looking at the extreme edge of the range of action that the fuel could have provided, I mean, we have to consider that the aircraft could even have been sort of over there in that sort of direction, and a very long way away from the initial search areas, indeed, which would be very challenging, I think, for the search and rescue authorities.
The prospect facing the search teams and the families is now terrifying. It is looking increasingly likely that the plane was hijacked. It is also possible, given satellite data, that the plane came down in some of the deepest waters anywhere on the planet, in an area much bigger than first thought. Not only that, but if it did follow a known aviation corridor with the main detection systems turned off, that would suggest the hijacker or hijackers knew exactly what they were doing.
We are now looking at large tracts of land crossing 11 countries as well as deep and remote oceans. The number of countries involved in the search and rescue operation has increased from 14 to 25, which brings new challenges of coordination and diplomacy to the search effort.
Now every passenger and crew member is under suspicion once again. Police in Malaysia search the houses of the two pilots and speak to their families. This flight simulator belonging to Captain Zahari is dismantled and reassembled in the hunt for any clue.
Yesterday, officers from the Royal Malaysian Police visited the home of the pilot. They spoke to family members of the pilot, and experts are examining the pilot's flight simulator. The police also visited the home of the co-pilot. According to Malaysian Airlines, the pilot and co-pilot did not ask to fly together on MH370.
The Malaysian Prime Minister has confirmed the ACARS system was probably disabled. But what does that mean? Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, or ACARS for short, is a computer which sends constant updates to the ground about the health of a plane. It will first try to communicate over radio frequencies before choosing to send signals back via a satellite network called SATCOM. Pilots can choose to request data and to send it. The system will also send automated messages throughout the flight. For these systems to be active, airlines have to pay for companies to run them. But the systems are built into all aircraft, so just because you don't pay for the service, it doesn't mean it won't try to transmit data. It is very easy for someone to pull the circuit breaker on the plane's transponder, which sends electronic replies to the ground when it receives a radio signal. They could also do the same on the ACAR system. But despite all this, the SATCOM antenna will still automatically ping away, trying to find a satellite to log on to.
It is possible for the aircraft to be transmitted on the ground as long as there's electrical power to the aircraft system.
As long as there is hope, the search will go on. That is the promise of the Chinese premier, no less. But even with all the resources that the superpower is dedicating to the cause, the fate of the Malaysia Airlines flight remains unknown. The families wait, longing for any small sign, a clue, a marker, anything. In the dark of a calm Kuala Lumpur night, MH370 took off on a routine flight north. An hour later, it vanished in what must be the greatest aviation mystery of recent times.